And I will chair it and I'll make sure there are no speeches, all right? Because Jane's the one that gives the speeches. Right, question.
Something that you didn't touch on, Jane, the role of education in all of this. Like, we need to have a culture where people are encouraged to participate in the democracy. There was 1 million people that didn't vote. I mean, the MMP system is probably okay. If a lot of those people voted, then we wouldn't have to hang up with David Seymour and his beard over golf.
Yeah, I agree, and I agree education, media, trade unions, iwi mobilisations, there are many arenas in which the politics has to happen. And what I've been trying to do in the book is actually say, but those things, that kind of activism in the form that Palani talked about with the double movement, you have the politics and the groundswell when the impacts of, in his case, the laissez-faire capitalism and the very financialised system of laissez-faire imploded, and people said this was intolerable over a period of several decades, from the time around World War I onwards. What I've been trying to do is to say, yes, but that isn't going to change things of itself. We need to understand also what the structural embedding mechanisms are that will resist and will provide for the resilience even when it's in a state of crisis. And we have to have something that we can replace it with, that we have legitimised as being the new orthodoxy. And that's where I think the hardest task is actually undoing the contractualisation of the state.
Yes.
Yeah. So in the 1920s and 30s, there was an alternative, and it was gradually made legitimate. Have you got, you've given us a number of things that you think need to change. Have you got any ideas on where that legitimate alternative is going to come from?
I think we're seeing it emerging already, and one of the important reflections on that period was that people didn't just invent totally new things. They took what was there and they reworked it with different values and different philosophies and different operational mechanisms. Yeah? I think that's, this, for example, some very good people working on public finance issues like Sue Newberry and others, accountants, who are trying to say, how do we put the public back into the role of accountancy? And I think if we've got people who are prepared to take the risks, and this is another point about the education, and especially in the tertiary education, people who will take the risks to think outside the box and gather support from similar thinking offshore, that gathers momentum. And some of the IMF papers, they talk about not only rediscovering history, and where's economic history taught these days in universities, but learning the lessons from our own histories, including the role of what they refer to as financial repression, mechanisms that are seen as, in this country, as intolerable, are increasingly being used in other countries. And we need to create an understanding here that what is referred to here as the orthodoxy is still the extreme end of what has become internationally discredited as a model in many of even the mainstream institutions. And so I think that shift is happening, but we're not that aware of it here. And I think that's one of our challenges, is to connect better with those debates.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ideas in there, some extreme and some not. The thing that strikes me the most is that there's a lot of what I would call orthodox economists that are backing, or that are talking about massive tax loopholes around housing, which is causing this massive bubble, a huge risk to our economy from farming in the Auckland housing market, and huge problems with debt as well. So there's orthodox economists talking about this sort of stuff, but the Kiwi public don't want to hear because la la la, I'm making money, so please keep quiet. So I mean, it's all very well to blame an orthodoxy or a bunch up high, but actually, how do you shift it when actually middle New Zealand baby boomers are creaming it?
I think the answer to that, from my viewpoint, is quite simple. There are a lot of vested interests in things remaining as they are. The finance industry has interests. Governments, and I include the former Labour government in this, have interests in cheap credit being made available and being fed out and for people to make up the gaps that they have in their earning power from credit. Households rely on that kind of credit and have become participants. You hear now people talking about buying property not because they need a house to live in, but to get on the property ladder. There aren't alternatives here. And no one actually wants to say the emperor has no clothes. And this is my deep concern of why, when I was writing the book, I said, let us not wait for Armageddon. And they got it a little bit wrong on national radio yesterday when they said, you said in the book that we have to wait for Armageddon. The signs are there. And the international commentators are saying it's there. The fiddling around we have here, what the Reserve Bank does with it changes in its ratios. It refuses to grapple with it. The government refuses to grapple with it because it doesn't have an alternative economic framework. I had the same argument on NBR radio today over the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. We don't actually need more market access for dairy milk powder into other markets. We need to have an innovative economy that is looking into the 21st century, and your intellectual property chapter is going to give monopoly rights over that will stymie our ability to do that. So let's have a debate about what's the economy going to look like in the 21st century. We don't have that debate here. We have we're a rock star because the credit rating agencies and HSBC have said we are, and because all of us are desperately want it to continue rolling over. And so I think we have to confront that. If we don't confront it, then we end up with a crisis. If we end up with a crisis, we have a mess.
We've got a few over here, we'll just go quickly.
What was that name?
Yes.
Okay, we're part of the global system, very much under the control of the military, industrial, congressional, media, financial complex. There's been a challenge of how to deal with overproduction for 40 years now. You talked of that sort of thing. And the answer is very clearly self-sufficient socialism. So my question to you is, do you agree that we should nationalise all that has been privatised under Roger Nolan and build up more of a socialised system, an actual policy?
Right, thanks. James?
No, I don't think I do, because I don't think it's that straightforward. I think we need to think differently and creatively about what a form of socialism might look like. And I was talking with some Māori the other day who are working on reconstruction of production on farmlands and how they might do ecologically sustainable farming that can still operate in local commercial marketplaces. And I think we need to think how, with climate change and energy scarcity issues, we deal with the problems of power, not political power, but power, and transportation. And I think for that reason I would agree with you that the export focus is going to become highly problematic, because I think it's actually going to be ecologically unsustainable. But I don't think we can just have a kind of sloganised alternative that is going to have any chance of actually gaining traction. I don't think any of us know what the next era is going to look like in terms of its economic models. And we're New Zealand, in our very quaint little remote zone with limited resources, but bountiful other resources, are going to fit. And I think that's a part of the interregnum. I mean, and that's part of what we've got to do. We've got to have that creative discussion, and Māori have got to be a key part of it.
Yes.
Do you think that the TVPA moves on SOEs to protect them? SOEs including Transpower as well as Meridian and all those others, to protect them from competition from small-scale distributed resources. Do you think the TVPA will prevent them from protecting their asset values? The leak of the document on SOEs that came out last week just gives some general frameworks. I don't think it is going to have that kind of effect, and I'll be writing something about it soon because of some of the things that we believe have been written into the chapter. But I do agree with you that it is going to make it much more difficult for small creative alternatives to be able to survive in what will be a competitive market between big international players and fully commercial SOEs. However, I have to say, and I know you have a particular interest in this, that there will be some protections in there for SOEs that provide services only in the domestic domain. So there will be some exemptions from rules for that. But you'll have to wait to see the text before we know what they are.
Piece about credit raters. In the documentaries I've seen about the financial crisis as it applied to the USA, they became completely discredited as being dishonest. So why the heck is New Zealand subject to their opinions, and why do they seem to have an opinion about all countries? They seem to have to toe the line by corruption.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we have to ask the financial journalists why they are still reporting those as if they're fact. There is an annex in the book which you might find interesting to read about how I tried to research the book. And one of the frustrations is that the credit rating reports you can't actually get. They're not even in the parliamentary library. The MPs can't get them there unless they pay the megabucks to get them. So what the journalists work off is the summaries that are given to them. There's no methodological analysis of how they go about making these judgment calls. And yes, they are totally discredited. They should be totally discredited, and journalists that cite them uncritically should be fired.
Somebody up there?
At grassroots level, what actually happens in Iceland? What changes do people actually have to make to achieve an economic transformation?
In Iceland, because it's a much smaller country even than ours, there was a lot did depend on the progressive government. I mean, I should have to say, firstly, it depended on people going and banging pots and pans and encircling the parliament and forcing those who had the executive who had taken power to finally hand over power. But the progressive government, it was crucially important that the Social Democrat Party in there had the Green Left activist base there prodding them. How it impacted on ordinary people. Ordinary people suffered still. I mean, they suffered, but they didn't suffer as badly as people did in Ireland. It was the rich who lost money rather than the poor, in a relative sense, in contrast to most of the other austerity-driven places. So, and there were real protections, and I think that there are some real lessons in that. When people talk about this is all globalisation and there's nothing we can do about it and it's all out there, what governments do matters. States, individual states make choices.
Politics matter. We've seen that in Greece. Society matters, politics matter, states still have power, and especially the fewer international agreements we've locked our hands up with, the more power they got.
Bring up the understanding.
I just want to ask, I actually come from Ireland, but that's another discussion. But just to ask you, to what extent do you, it seems to me that there is a contempt for the use of the law and constitution and administrative law that prevails in the left, and as a result of that, a failure to recognise the power of judicial review. I'm interested in the fact that you've availed of judicial review yourself in the last week, and it seems to me to be the case that it's at least worth a try in terms of inventing and building an alternative politics on the left to avail of the process of judicial review and transform the field of administrative law in doing so.
I don't think I'd start with the courts. I think I'd start with those who are influential voices in the legal and political arena, and there are some critical voices in there who start creating the space and start shifting the ground in which lawyers and judges may start to think differently. And I think one of the lessons of how that can happen here is what happened in the 70s and 80s on the Treaty of Waitangi. The work that was done by historians and lawyers and others really shifted the ground, and then the courts shifted too. And so I think we have to create the context for courts, especially that are driven by systems of precedent and so on, to be prepared to take those moves.
Yes.
There's quite an international, I mean, you refer often to the international scene. I feed off lots of blogs and stuff written by what in the end is a small group of politically active, often economists, really. And again, it's not something you get much of a sense of anything at all in New Zealand, sadly. But nonetheless, they can be sort of wheeled out under a sort of, with a conspiracy of silence even amongst perhaps academic economists. But there's a big critique, a very old critique of most of the propositions made in neoliberal economics. They don't get taught at university.
And I think what we've got to start doing is bringing some of those people here. And I think that's a role that the Fabians and others can play in breaking the cocoon, breaking the... there's one of the IMF papers talks about the state of denial that affluent countries are in about the potential for crisis. And so I think we really do have to get that sense of orthodoxy that legitimates the end of the spectrum challenged in ways that make, and we've had this experience with the TVPA, we've had journalists who were highly sceptical initially. The more exposure they've had to the arguments and the more credible the arguments are, the more they've shifted.
Just on that point, I know that the Fabians have some money to be able to provide funding for people to come out, and some of those suggestions would be good to put through to Mike Smith and the organising crew so that they can look at some of those people.
I'm really interested in how we close the gap between the high-level economic discussion that Jim was referring to and the grassroots understanding of what's going on. I mean, for me, thinking simplistically, why people are still voting in neoliberal government goes back to the whole cargo cult idea of there's this magic promise that somebody will bring something in and you will benefit. And that seems to be the thing that so many people are still bought into it. Now, with the climate debate, we've actually seen the shift over many, many years to finally having the President of the US coming out and saying there is no planet B. So while I understand you saying sloganeering won't do anything, at the same time, I think a lot of this discussion is in such complex sort of terms that unless you have a background in it, it is quite off-putting to ordinary people. They may know they're poor, but they buy the promises.
And that's why I think there are multi-layers of what has to be done. And I identified what I think are 6 dimensions, and I think the 6th is, look, there is a challenge. What are unions going to do if there is a serious recession and ordinary local households of workers are bust? Yeah? What are the unions going to do? Because the state doesn't have the money there. If we have a recession and they run an austerity argument, then people are going to be hung out to dry even further. So there are, and I was actually talking to Helen Kelly about this a little while back, and we were talking about the forestry thing. And it's not just the deaths in the forestry sector, it's systemic. Yeah? So how do we connect what is happening with people's lives, losing loved ones in the forestry sector, to the fact that we have a risk-tolerant approach across the board, whether it's leaky buildings or the rest homes or whatever. And I think that's a real challenge for those who are working in those communities, to try to generate debates about what needs to be done differently. And how they connect the dots to what's happening to Nana in the rest home.
And Tally's meat workers.
And Tally's meat, and the Pike River guys, and the...
Can I ask if you have feedback that you're receiving, some grounds for optimism?
This is... I am optimistic. The whole...
Examples of maybe people who've changed their minds, or political movement that you see happening?
Yeah, I mean, the book is actually hugely optimistic. In that I think we are in an era where things are going to change. I think we are seeing those morbid symptoms, and we have to make them the progressive as opposed to the regressive option. And yes, there are people who are changing their thinking. I mean, for goodness sake, who would have thought that Martin Wolf would have written an influential book that talked about the failure of the neoliberal regime he's championed for 30 years. And that's what I meant about multi-layers. There's the community realities of households, and then it's also important to see that insiders, speaking truth to their own power, help create a momentum for things to shift. And you know, this is very much pulling some of those strands together. There are many more strands out there, and we've got to create more of them. But I'm optimistic. Can't go like it has been.
Right, one last question from someone who hasn't asked, and there's one other person who wants a second term.
There's a young person.
Hi. So we've talked a lot about government responsibility and personal responsibility, but what I'm wondering is, what's the role of private corporations in sort of catalysing this paradigm? Are you thinking that they should just roll over and die a quiet death in the corner, or more that our definition of corporate success needs to change?
That's part of where the values comes in, and that's part of what Tony Malloy was talking about how corporations operate. But there's a discussion in the beginning of the chapter about New Zealand on Fire, which talks about the shifts that occurred in the 1980s and 1990s and the rise of shareholder capitalism, and some interesting debates of what happened in Fletcher Challenge that some people here will remember. And Hugh Fletcher saying, no, that the role of the board is to look at the company in the big picture in the longer term and how it fits in the economy and so on. And those who took control of the board said, no, the role is to return the maximum as quick as possible to your shareholders. And that's what happened. And then if you look at the shift from shareholder capitalism to the role of private equities, and the massively powerful role of private equities now, not just as investors on their own, but as investors, for example, in public-private partnerships, then you see how that model is playing out. And I think there's some really serious questions that have to happen inside, especially people working in the corporate sector, working in corporate law, and working in the business media.
Right. And there, and then the last person is...
You mentioned a sense of optimism. The question, I guess, is more the latter part is where they're at the moment in terms of being a source of organisation and shifting things along to a new position. I kind of, have you seen the wheels ticking in that sense within an organisation like